In 2003, I went to Cuba for a week. I went to visit the Cuban Institute of Meteorology, part of my profession, right? Hydrology, meteorology. So I arrived on Saturday night. Then the Sunday morning, I got up very early, and I decided to walk around Malecon, that's the seawall, around Havana. So I'm walking, and I saw an Afro-Cuban with two little boys, dark skin. So they kind of resembled me in a way, right? So I walked up to the guy. I said, "Buenos días, señor." Good morning, sir. ¿Cómo está? How are you? He said, "Muy bien, gracias." ¿Y usted? I said, "Muy bien también." "Very well, okay." I said, "Señor, tenemos un problema." He said, "So we have a problem. Esos dos chicos son los míos. Those two boys are mine. Y he venido acá para llevarlos a mi país. I've come here to take them to my country." But he realized I was joking. Right? He started to laugh. And we started to talk. And he took me home. This is about mid-morning, midnight, 9 o'clock in the morning, a Sunday. Took me home and met his family and everything. I bought some drinks. They started to cook. I had lunch. And they invited some of the neighbors. It's an apartment complex. So they invited some of the neighbors. And apparently one of the neighbors is very much into collecting coins and, memorabilia. And he had this 10 pesos. So I asked him, how much, I'm interested in this. How much you'll take for this? He said 20 US. So I said, "Give it me one time." So I paid 20 US for this, which in Cuba at that time is probably a month's salary for some people. Right? So it's a lot of money for them. And that's why I came into possession of one of my most prized possessions. 10 pesos with the signature of Che Guevara.
I often feel not adequately trained when I go to meetings, particularly in Central and South America, and to hear colleagues from universities in those countries speak in Spanish, which you would expect them to speak, or Portuguese from Brazil, but also being able to converse in English. And many of us from the English-speaking Caribbean are unidimensional. And our colleagues from South America, Central America, are quite conversant in both
Learning
languages.
a second language for me is like literacy. I consider myself very illiterate. And I mean, when I studied in the Netherlands, the core language was English. But my classmates came from all over the world. And for some of them, English was their second or third language. And I think we in the Caribbean are really lucky. We should all be getting A's and in everything we do, because we are learning and studying our first language. But in many countries of the world, to get a university education, you have to learn English.
The question is not about being easy or being hard. It is about, do you have any other choice? Just to let you know, if you go to Montreal, Canada, you'll see that the average people there will speak 5 languages. Average. Even the people who are like, janitors will speak at least 3 languages. Janitors.
I'm sure I have. I'm sure I have been at a disadvantage, a self-inflicted disadvantage. I'm sure I have. And as I said, I have become increasingly ashamed because I see, for example, people say the French hate to learn other languages. Maybe that was true in the past, but I don't think it's true anymore, because I see my French Antillean or French colleagues making tremendous efforts to learn English and communicate in English, and I don't think we are reciprocating.
The point I want to make is that in today's world, as a professional and someone who wants to advance one's own career, or you wish to advance the company or the institution you wish to work for, I do believe having knowledge of a second language is absolutely important.
I don't know how many people know this story, but you know Nelson Mandela, he learned Afrikaans. Afrikaans was the language of his oppressors. But in Robben Island in jail, he actually spent time learning Afrikaans. And very often, he would meet the guards, prison guards, or the wardens they call them, I think. And he would greet them in Afrikaans and practice his Afrikaans with them. And I think one of the reasons he did that, if you read the writings of Mandela, he would say that to understand the Africans, the psyche, and the way they thought, he had to learn their language. In fact, there's a very famous quotation from Mandela. He said, if you speak to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. But if you speak to a man in his own language, that goes to his heart. And I think that is the basis of learning a language, because when you interact with the culture, the people appreciate you more, and they create that sort of emotional bond with you, give you a sort of dignity and respect that you wouldn't really normally get if you're just trying to communicate.
If you go to another country to do research, where the primary spoken language is not English, you often have to hire translators, right? And you have to rely on them to interpret your interviews, your findings. But if you're actually proficient, you can do that yourself, and you're probably able to capture, if you're fluent, you know, the nuances of that language as well. So that greatly helps in research, and also just communication generally. I mean, you know, we travel all the time, and when you travel to another country that's not English speaking, it becomes difficult.
First of all, because I think it's true that you can't fully understand another culture unless you know something about the language. So if we wish to know more about the world and more about other cultures, we need to be able to read some of their literature in their own languages and communicate and so on.
Even in France, where I was at the time when I was there, a lot of the literature was in the English language. That is probably going to be less and less the case now, but that was how it was. And asking the young French student not to speak language, or he claiming that it's impossible for him to speak English, it's a foolish thing to say. It is not true. And when we go to a place like Aruba, where I was, or Curacao, and you see the youngest of people speaking 2 and 3 languages effortlessly, I mean effortlessly, that is what we have to try and attain.
Our education system has been spoiled by our focus on exams. So learning is for passing exams and getting a job. So the importance of learning as tools for life, I think, well, we've totally lost that. And I think we really need to shift our whole focus of what formal education is about.
There is absolutely no reason why you should limit your studies, let us say, to Trinidad or to Jamaica or to USA or Canada or England. You can do your studies in Venezuela, in Argentina, or you may do your studies in the United States, but in terms of your professional contacts and conferences, you can think of going to conferences and liaising with professional colleagues in Spain or in Costa Rica. So you use it for anything really. Similarly, you're a musician. Why do you have to think that you make your living only in an English-speaking world? We sit right off of South America, where there is English, where there is Spanish, Portuguese, and French. You know, we can turn to those places.
For us in this part of the world, it's important because we want to see the rest of the world much more than people from there want to come to the Caribbean. So that I think that it's important if you're a student, we have the Center for Language Learning, take that opportunity, you know, just make sure that you get that basic understanding of the foreign language, especially if you want to be a citizen of the world.
Anybody who wants to be a true citizen of this region of the Caribbean must understand the need to have facility in as many languages as possible. And I think Trinidad like my village in Nigeria, is really at a crossroad of languages, because you have the Spanish-speaking mainland right next door, you have the Francophone islands close by, you have, of course, all the other English-speaking countries around. So I think Trinidad is the ideal country for the promotion and the learning of French, Spanish, and English.
In fact, English-speaking people are really a minority in the Caribbean. So very often we want to visit institutions like in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Cuba, where they speak Spanish, or we want to visit Guadeloupe or Martinique because we have colleagues there. Although there are some people who speak English, you feel more comfortable when you speak their language. And it's easier for you to get around, to mingle with the people. You know, I like to go to the market, to the stores and so forth. And when you speak that language, it's much easier. You can ask for directions and so forth, right? So you don't feel like a dummy when you go in a country and you're looking for people to interpret what you're saying. So from that point of view, learning a language is extremely important. And it makes travel enjoyable and a lot of fun. And it's more satisfying when you speak the language in a country that you visit.
What I have done over the years is that I have consciously found a way to marry my French and Spanish with my work as a librarian and also my profession as a historian.
If I'm looking for somebody for a job and they have conversational or written language skills other than English, I think that is very something that's very positive that I look at.
There are jobs, for instance, at the IDB, which are always open to people who speak both English and Spanish. And it's a most amazing thing that they are always taken by native Spanish speakers because they take the time to learn English, and we don't take the time to learn Spanish.
For instance, when I go to lecture to Ecuador, I teach in English. Or in Colombia, I teach in English. Because students will actually appreciate, you know, as a matter of fact, a local, you know, that understands the local culture, that speaks English, that will teach them, you know, some sort of a specialty English or English for business purposes. Okay? So having the capacity to be multilingual, but yet understanding the local culture is a very powerful combination. As a professional, it will empower you, it will open you doors, and, you know, in very unpredictable ways. You know, it was very curious because I was, you know, telling some friends that I wouldn't ever have thought in my life that they will hire me in France to teach in Spanish or in Ecuador to teach in English. It's some sort of a very strange thing, but it opens the doors and options in very unpredictable manners.
But I think it is the hard fact that those of us who grew up speaking English have less motivation. But you know that may change. Now, as we speak, English does seem to be the international language. But in 10 or 20 years, what might it be, do you think?
Chinese, and of course Chinese is also important because of the world in which we live in. China is a world power, one of the leaders in trade, and therefore as professionals you also, I think, being conversant in Chinese, Mandarin would give you a real cutting edge and a leading edge.
And I would like to also add that if students want to see themselves as being more than Caribbean citizens, being global citizens, then they have to consider the need to have facility in languages like Chinese. The Chinese people are going to become the most important peoples of the world in a very short time.
Simply because of where the world is going. We can no longer afford to think that we are, but we are fortunate that we speak English, which is an international language, today's international vehicle for discourse, but that is not going to last forever, and it is always better when you're dealing with people, especially in areas where business is concerned and so on, that you are able to speak the language of the people that you are dealing with.
But I think until you've gone to a country and felt left out because you were unable to converse. And that has happened to me so many times. You won't appreciate it. So I really think that the opportunities here for the Center for Language Learning are brilliant, and I think students should definitely make the best use of it. I can't stress that anymore, that this is an important complement to your education, and to be educated without an additional language is really to be lacking.
As a young man, as a teenager, I was learning Spanish in school, in secondary school. But because I grew up in Cedros, it's a fishing village. I know people know it's a fishing village. The fishermen would go to Venezuela. There are two villages on the outskirts of Venezuela, on the coast of Venezuela, called Capure and Pedernales. So as a young man, adventurous, I would go to Capure and Pedernales with the fishermen. So when in class, the other students see Spanish as a subject, a whole set of vocabulary to learn, a whole set of grammar to learn, I actually saw it as a tool for communication. And a tool for communication with some pretty nice chicks in Venezuela, you know. So that was motivation for me to learn Spanish, right? It wasn't just a subject, it was a language. So I think I had an advantage over my classmates in that Spanish wasn't a subject, it was a method of communication with some very pretty girls.
But you know, there's another thing I wanted to tell you about language. And again, it goes back to our past when it comes to giving us this breadth of language and culture, because the two things are intertwined. Our colonial history really put us in this one-dimensional stream about English and Mother England and Europe, etc. But I feel really disadvantaged as someone who came out of indentureship, because my great-grandfather came from India. Someone who was immersed and still is immersed in an environment surrounded by Indian culture, Indian religion, etc., be it in Guyana and probably more dominant in Trinidad and Tobago, that I don't know Hindi. And I think that's a travesty.
The Creole language in itself has the structure of it is often informed by African languages. But apart from that linguistic association, one of the things that is very interesting about the Trinidad Creole is that it's the closest Creole in the Caribbean to the West African Creole, Pidgin English, which is also one of the languages I speak. So that it's a lot easier for a Nigerian who speaks Pidgin to come into Trinidad and be able to follow the Creole language. It's more difficult for them to follow the Jamaican Creole, because that is not as close to the West African Creole as the Trinidad Creole is. Then Trinidad and Tobago, because historically it has its ancestries in India, in Africa, there's also the need, even if it's for a psychological reason, to learn a language that will connect them to India, or a language that will connect them to Africa. So that the point I'm making therefore is that Trinidad and Tobago, especially Trinidad, has a perfect history which encourages an ability to speak as many languages as possible. So it was an advantage for me coming here in 1977 and coming with facility in Pidgin English to understand the Trinidad Creole very easily. Of course, that does not mean that I didn't have challenges with words like lime, because the concept of the lime, I think, is unique to Trinidad.
I would say that English is my primary language because I use it, you know, all the time. And the only time I speak Thai is actually when I interact with friends and family. When I go home to visit or on the phone, I mean, it's very limited. The only problem is you can't use Thai anywhere else in the world except for in Thailand. So in that sense, I really don't think I'm fluent in another language other than English because Thai is my native tongue.
I always feel ashamed because I don't speak more languages. And I know people who speak easily 5, 6, and I really envy them because I know that they have a big, big advantage over me. And it's just, I'm ashamed.
Having a foreign language exposes you to a very large part of the world that you would bypass had you stayed within an English-speaking cocoon. The world is not 100% an English-speaking world, and there are people out there who speak other languages. Because they speak other languages, they have different